So welcome to this class where we're going to, in our second intensive class, I want to start by looking at scientific knowledge and the way in which scientists approach knowledge can be said to be a very important approach to critical thinking. And we'll look further at some of the methods that are used in scientific approaches, such as posing questions and also looking at theories and literature and ideas. Also, we can use quantitative and qualitative methods. So quantitative is where we collect numbers, we make observations and we say that so many people do this or that. And then qualitative, we ask open-ended questions. Why do you do this? And then we have chains of reasoning, and then we generalize, and then we communicate what we find. So that's one model, and I want to come back to that in a moment. But science, it's helped our world a lot, and critical thinking in science has helped a lot. And you may be able to think of some examples. For instance, we had an illness developed out of parts of Asia and China, COVID, and then panic. What do we do? One of the first things to do is to observe what do we know about the illness, and then to use a microscope, look at the blood, see what we can identify about the illness, and then having identified it, what are some theories and models we have to developing a vaccine? What are some theories and models to helping people who are ill with this illness, COVID? So scientific methods have been very, very helpful there. But in education, science can be helpful as well. We can ask questions about how do students learn? And in your teaching, you'll be asked to write reports at times on how are your students going, how are they learning. You're asked to attend seminars and studies to study subjects like this, critical thinking. And so in some ways, science is very, very helpful. But this raises the question, what is meant by science? So let's ask a few students now what is meant by science. So Hannah and Karen. Hannah, what do you see as meant by science?
It can be kind of just the exploration. So I see what we use science for as exploring God's creation. We're exploring what he's like. As we expand or research or look into subjects, we're seeing what God's created and seeing how it all works, and it can apply to just normal everyday life as well, like see how God created us to be. So that's kind of my understanding of science, and it can be to do with experiments or, like you said, looking at an illness, sourcing, like breaking it all down. And
Yeah, and interesting that you mentioned looking at creation. Many great scientists like Isaac Newton and Galileo, Kepler, Copernicus and others also said the same thing that you said, Hannah, that science is about observing creation and then describing what's there. And so scholars of the history of science have said that many scientists through the 15, 16, 1700s, Leonardo da Vinci and others, saw that it was about describing what is out there in creation. Karen, what do you think is meant by science?
I think science perhaps is observing, and from that observation creating data to measure something in particular. So whether it be academic, whether it be anything to do with the field of biology or geology.
Yeah, so good. And collecting that data, then we have understanding, don't we? And so it could be geology, as you say. We collect data about the rocks, and then we work out that they have iron ore in them. And then we work out that using engineering, we can collect that iron ore, and we can, and so there are all these different sciences like chemistry and biology. We can understand the world around us, and that helps us. And so we find that science can help us understand nature, can understand our bodies. Some people say that science is about smart people in white lab coats. I guess that may be some aspects of science. It's regularly in the news, and scientific literacy can be important. That is, knowing some of the symbols for calcium and other chemicals can help in health. So scientific literacy can be important. So the purpose of science education is not just to train a tiny fraction of the population. We need all people to know some science in order that they might be able to do well, said Carl Wyman, a Nobel Prize winning scientist. So science education seeks to increase people's understanding of science and knowledge through these approaches in science. And science education is very important as one of the subjects in schools, and it applies in every subject, whether you do cooking or whether you do physical education and sport, whatever the subject is, art, science, music, science is involved in every one of the subjects that students study. Looking at astronomy and the stars helps us to understand. Even native people will see the stars and astronomy, telling them about the seasons, telling them about changes that are taking place. There's chemistry, tells us about the elements around us. There's life sciences, tell us about the nature of people. So science uses methods, and they do vary a bit from geology to chemistry, but there's also some similarities in these methods. And one of the resources we're going to use quite a bit is the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. And there is an article there on science and scientific method. And so if we go to that article on the scientific method, you might find that a useful resource to read on the approaches that are used in science. And so scientific method probably has about 5 or 6 steps to it, and these are very similar to the critical thinking approaches that we use. And the Stanford Encyclopedia talks about the history of these methods. One particular useful subject as well as science is history. So history tells us where ideas come from. And so every one of your subjects, and you might each have favorite subjects, or we could look at the history of education. History can be important. I'm interested in art, and there's a history of art. Interested in cooking, there's a history of cooking. So history is useful, and it tells us where ideas come from. When it comes to science, science goes way back to the Greeks, and Aristotle came up with some ideas on science. And we could go back 2,000 years and we could look at Aristotle's ideas on science. And interestingly, the same ideas about knowledge from 2,000 years ago are still used somewhat today. I've mentioned before that some of these resources from 2,000 years ago can be found online today, like prior and posterior analytics by Aristotle 2,000 years ago, 300 BC. We could find that online today. And there's a couple of resources that you could go to find those. So if I put in free, online, PDF or free download, then there'll be a few resource places where you can read that. Let's have a look here. So here we go. Aristotle's writings available on your desktop if you go there today. He begins by saying, when it comes to knowledge, that we start with questions. And so book 1 of all instruction given or received proceeds from pre-existing knowledge. So Aristotle says before you start thinking something like in mathematics or science, you've already got some knowledge. And so we say in education, it's important to consider the entering knowledge that different students have, so we know where they're at, and then we build on that knowledge. Aristotle says pre-existing knowledge is of 2 kinds. There is some which must be assumed, and then there is others which we can observe. And so there are these different types of knowledge. And then he goes on to discuss these different types of knowledge. Interesting, 2,000 years ago, he talked about scientific knowledge. That is knowledge that can be tested and verified. So the discussion of science goes back to 2,000 years ago when we had Aristotle putting forward these ideas. And in book 2, he talks about how we often begin with questions. And so it's the questions that we ask and start with that are very important, and they are going to be important in any form of knowledge that we start with. So if you're going to start with science and questions, it's important to start with the questions. Who was Aristotle? This is one of those quiz questions. Who was Aristotle's teacher? And then who was his teacher? Let's put Olivia there in the quiz box. Olivia, who was Aristotle's teacher? Was that a shake of the head? Don't know?
Yeah, I've got no idea.
Oh, there we go. You don't make the $100 on their quiz or whatever. Actually, due to budget cuts, we're down to 10 cents. But yes, Rachel, who was Aristotle's teacher?
Honestly, don't know, but because it's up on the screen, Socrates.
Yes, so Socrates is the teacher of Plato, who is the teacher of Aristotle. So well done. Do we give Rachel the 10 cents? We'll have a decision on that shortly from our adjudicators. And so Socrates is the Greek teacher who then trains up one of his students, Plato, who you can still read his material online. And then Plato trains up one of his students, who is Aristotle. Now, 2 major types of thinking. Firstly, Aristotle. So we'll start with the student Aristotle. He says thinking is so often helped by observation, recording, and if we can be accurate in our observation and recording, then we're going to have good thinking. So Aristotle, he focuses on objectivity, what we can see and describe, what can be verified. Others can see it as well. Others can say we observe, then that is good thinking. And so in the classroom, if we know a certain textbook or method is useful, we then observe the students using it, and we write down that 60–70% of the students found that that was useful. So observation, recording, objectivity, verifying things by doing these approaches. And this, Aristotle refers to this as scientific, that it is a very useful approach. Can anyone think of a weakness with this emphasis on observing, recording, writing down what we see? Karen, do you have any thoughts on what a weakness is with this approach? What's not being considered there?
Perhaps the way someone can either verbalize, someone can actually decipher the information, which stems back to, like, in the classroom when a child may not be able to write very well, but can actually draw or could create something artistically. So maybe something like that.
Exactly. So there's other ways of knowing besides the one way. Anyone else able to think of some other ways of knowing that are not covered by Aristotle? Tiffany?
Yeah, so questioning, asking questions, other people's ideas, so listening to other people, and not rushing. Sometimes we can get the information and that's matter of fact, and we're not asking the questions, we're not waiting to see how that answer, where the train of thought's going.
Yeah, so good. And so we've got the questions, and certainly Socrates said this. He said that the questions can be more important than the answers. And Socrates would say not jumping to conclusions is important. So don't rush the answers, which you've said very well, Tiffany. Don't rush towards the answers there. And so the longer you can leave the questions, the better it can be. However, you'll find that when you're writing your essays, etc., you have to go with an answer. So you can't hang on forever. If your assignment's due in 4 weeks or 6 weeks, you've got to go with one possibility, but you might then admit other possibilities. And so at the end of your essay, you might say, but there are other ways this could be looked at. And I like what you say, Tiffany, about other people's ideas. Any group that you're a part of is going to give you one set of ideas. But when you join another group, they'll give you another group. So if you join a psychology group, then they're only going to see things in terms of psychology. And if you join a group that is about tablets that people take, like psychiatry, and they're discussing the tablets that people take, then ADHD is going to be solved not by counselling, it's going to be solved by the tablets you take. And so the group you join tell you about how things are going to be thought through. And so whichever group you're a part of is going to shape the way you see the world. And if you're a part of a particular religious group, you'll see answers in terms of that group. So Aristotle's observations, he's claiming that we make these accurate observations and we record, but he's not really necessarily thinking about all of these bigger questions and issues there that take place. And so let's have a look now at his teacher's teacher, Socrates. So Socrates said that more important than the answers were the questions. And when it comes to your teaching, then you shouldn't be rushing in just with answers. To use a Socratic method, you should be using the questioning method. So questioning looks at ill-considered statements or concepts. So you say to Johnny about doing homework, and Johnny says, I don't need to do homework because I know it already. And then instead of just giving him a lecture, you might say, Johnny, have you thought through what you're saying about the homework and knowing it already? So ill-considered statements come out when you ask questions. Inconsistencies come out. The original statement and concepts redefined. So homework, what do you think homework is? Why do you think we give homework, Johnny? And then a new definition. Homework is to help you. It's not a punishment. And so Socrates put forward the Socratic method. And in the Socratic method, there is an encouragement to ask questions to find out by learning through these questions the essence of something, what makes it real. And so as Christians, we could say, what's holiness, what's justice. And Socratic questioning brings out the ignorance that people don't know. One of the things Socrates talked about was examining your own life. And so he would ask questions about, why do you think that way? What do you think it means to put into practice? What is your life doing? How's it going? So if you don't know what life is and what you're doing, then that won't work. Socrates also said that virtue is knowledge. That is, knowledge is virtue and virtue is knowledge. So when you know something, then it helps you be a better person. And when you're a better person, it helps you to know things. And so actions are better. So Socratic method has an emphasis on questions, and to use it in the classroom is to encourage questions in the classroom. And it's the first step in the scientific method, is to ask good questions. So a meaningful question is as good as the right answer. Actively engaging students in critical thinking engages them in the questions. So it's a very ancient approach, and it was used by Socrates, who approached people. Instead of giving them answers, he would give questions. And so we're talking about learning and intelligence. So instead of saying learning is, memorizing, etc., we would ask, what do you think learning is? And then students would say, finding something new. Why is finding something new important? So every time you come up with an answer, teacher, you don't give another answer, you go back to more questions. And there's no one correct answer. We keep exploring the world through more and more questions. How do you teach? Through questioning. In Theory and Practice of Teaching by Peter Jarvis, he says, questioning involves helping learners to call to mind what they've learnt previously and pre-consciously, and to think about what they know already. So you might ask, what do you know about this already? What's beyond your present knowledge? It's leading the learners from what they know already through questions to, and then often we do have an idea where they're going. That is, we have been explorers of the world of knowledge, teachers have already, and so we're leading you on a path. So it's not totally without knowledge, these questions. We know where people are going already. So that's good teaching, is to know where they're going, but we don't reveal it all at once. We take steps using questions, says Socrates. So begin with questions, what do you know already? And then questions, what can you discover? And then further deeper questions, why? Some children are very good at this, aren't they? They're annoying, aren't they, when they ask questions? So teaching through questioning, we start learners on a questioning process, and then we keep going along there. So Kenneth Seacon said, what is forgotten is not lost forever. It can be recalled with sufficient effort, and then questions help bring that forward. So we ask students to consider different viewpoints to look at the task. So not only do we ask questions, we say, what are some of the different ways people would view this? Conducting a Socratic seminar, you get the students to sit round, and it might be just 2 students asking questions of one another, or it might be 3 or 4 in groups. And then we ask questions, come up with discussion, ask more questions. It's important to be flexible, to allow students to express their opinions, allow mistakes, encourage mistakes. Don't be afraid of silence. Create a safe space where you can get it wrong. So encourage students that it's okay to get it wrong. However, you should also have expected outcomes of intellectual engagement should be encouraged, cooperation, conversation. We're not just seeking to answer questions, but to generate more questions and inquiry, and the teacher is the facilitator who's going to encourage the questions to go forward. So in a Socratic seminar, you might define what we're looking at. You might want to stick to the point, clarify. Instead of raising hands, you might take it in turns, so everyone has to speak once before another person can speak a second time. You might want to break into groups. One of the difficulties, if you've got 25 students and you've only got one answering, or we've got 8 students here, if we were to break into groups, then you can have a lot more discussion taking place. So even here, if we were to break into 5 groups, then 50% of you could all be talking instead of just me talking. So that would be a better approach. So I encourage you to use group works where you can. Talk to each other, not just the leader, discuss ideas, not just opinions, take risks and make mistakes. So you might arrange the desks in a circle. So that means that there's no priority to any particular one. You might give a set of guidelines as well. So if we were to say that there are 6 steps in questioning and Socratic dialogue, first might be to focus, what's the topic? Another might be to give examples, sometimes from your experience. And then another might be to examine the principles and generate answers. So that's one way to develop this approach. So Socratic questioning, Socratic method seeks to develop these approaches. So that's the first step in the scientific method, is questioning, and it's also one of the important approaches that we use in the classroom. So there's just a few notes there. One of the key differences is that in questioning, the lecturer doesn't lecture, they pose questions, doesn't answer them, and then the students are a lot more actively engaged in that they are asking questions there as well. So that's the questioning method. So let me just go here to the sciences. So we've said that you can explore further of the scientific method by going to those who've written about it. And one of the first steps in the scientific method, Socrates said, was asking questions. And then Plato comes next, and then Aristotle comes thirdly in the list of people. So we've got Socrates, and we've got questions, and then we've got Aristotle said he had all the observation, the recording, objectivity, and so forth. Plato, he has a different emphasis beyond Aristotle, in that Plato says what is unseen is often more important than what is seen. Now, science often focuses on what can be seen and measured, but Plato says it's all these unseen things that are often just as important. We mentioned before about developing a vaccine for an illness like COVID, but Plato would say, what do we know about the causes that are unseen? What do we know about the social contexts that are unseen? What about the history of illnesses in the past? What do we know? And the history of it. Plato would say that there is much more that we need to consider than simply observing and recording. Now, of course, one of the dangers with Plato's approach is that it opens up the door to so much, and that makes it more difficult. Whereas Aristotle's approach simply focusing on accurate observations, recording, it's a lot more doable, isn't it? And we've said before, in terms of intelligence with the children, it's good to give a nice intelligence test of 10 questions and you can work out who the bright students are. However, that won't necessarily solve all things, will it? Plato would say there's much more going on. What about their family background? What about all that is unseen? So in week 1 of these 12 weeks of class, we're going to start off by looking at critical thinking and what it is. And we've already done that on Monday, but on week 1, we'll look further at that. In week 2, there's going to be notes and videos on the Greeks. And we're going to look at these 3 Greeks, Socrates and his questions, Plato and the unseen, and Aristotle with his nice, accurate observations and recording. Interestingly, in history, after about 400 or 300 AD, when Christianity grew, Christians felt that Aristotle's approach was a bit too limited and they focused on Plato and the unseen. Can anyone think why Christianity focused on Plato and the unseen? Rachel, any thoughts on why Christians focused on Plato and the unseen and they forgot about Aristotle and all of the seen? Any thoughts, Rachel?
I think because obviously our God is unseen, and it's because, you know, he's unseen, we believe in him supernaturally and everything, that it was much more aligned with their beliefs and the focus that they wanted to put within the church at that time. And that because Aristotle was a little bit more of a scientific thinker, even if it wasn't directly towards science, it was like observe, like what can you physically see, that it didn't always line up with what the Christianity thoughts and beliefs were, especially at that time of, no, like our God is unseen, we know he's there, but like Aristotle's all about like, well, what can you actually see, like observe all of this, which I think, you know, it, yeah, like I said, it wouldn't really line up with what they're thinking, their beliefs at that point of time, that Plato was very much more in like along the sides of how they would like to think and feel.
Exactly. And so because of history, we moved into the medieval period. And in the medieval period with knights and castles, there tended to be more of this focus on Plato. In 400 AD, we have Augustine, who also tends to focus on the unseen and philosophy. And so that tends to grow as importance, and Aristotle gets lost. However, there is another part of the world, and that is the Arab world. And over in the Arab world around 700 AD, Muhammad, Muslim world emerges. And it's in the Muslim world that we have Aristotle preserved. And around about 1100 AD, trade with the Arab world increases, and there is a rediscovery of Aristotle. And so interesting twists of history, that with the rediscovery of Aristotle, we have teachers like Aquinas in Paris reintroduce Aristotle, and partly the scientific world comes back into the universities in that way. Not that it ever left, but certainly there is this changed approach. And then with Martin Luther, there is the Reformation, and there is a renewed emphasis on the natural world. And with the renewed emphasis on the natural world, Christian thinkers like Francis Bacon start to focus on what we can see and observe. And so we have the emerging of the scientific approach again, where we observe and measure. And a lot of people weren't so keen on that. They felt we needed to stick with the Greek thinking rather than to move on with this observation and description. But gradually from that time, mathematics increases not only in accounting, but there's mathematics increases in its emphasis, and that gets applied to science as well. And so we have the growth of the scientific approach to things. So Aristotle described the approaches that are used in science. It died out through some of the medieval period, and then it was rediscovered by Francis Bacon in the 1500s. And then Galileo applies it to looking at the movement of the Earth around the sun. And so we see that scientific approaches increase. And then Isaac Newton applies this in the principles of optics and gravity. So the idea of gravity as a force in physics gets applied there by Isaac Newton. So the scientific approach develops further through observation and through these methods. Let me just go through the application of the scientific methods to education. There was a good article that I read here on scientific research in education, which talks about some of the steps that we can take in education. So the first step is, if you're going to be a good teacher, observe. So firstly, actually before observing, we need to pose significant questions. So can you tell me, what are some of the questions that you could be asking in the classroom? So you're a teacher, you're working in a classroom. Can I get you all to write down 2 or 3 questions? So what are significant questions for teachers in the classroom? What are 2 to 3 significant questions for teachers in the classroom? And then beyond that, the scientific principle would move to observation. So we'd think about what observations can be made. That's according to Aristotle's approach. He would say, what observations can we make that give us answers? So Bridget, do you have some thoughts on what are some questions that you would think would be valuable to ask?
Yeah, sure. So I've got one down, which like it'll be with regarding to any topic, I guess. First off, I would probably say, okay, boys and girls, what do we know about this topic, or what is something you already know about this topic? And how can we work this out together, or how can we find the answer to this to the question, or to as to what we are talking about?
Yeah, so good. So first, what do we know? And then secondly, how can we find knowledge? And you could even say, what are the sources of knowledge?
Yeah.
And you could then even ask, is this a good source? And so you could then discuss whether it's a good source or not. So they could be useful as well. So that's great. Now, Neil, do you have some thoughts on some questions that we could ask as teachers?
Also, what just wondering or being curious about how they got that answer. And what how could that have been different?
Yes. And this can be quite important in classroom management as well. in that you can ask these questions. Why did you decide it was a good thing to poke so-and-so, or whatever, with a pair of scissors, you know, and how did you decide this was a good thing? Well, I didn't think about it, miss, I just did it. Yeah, but let's take a bit more time. It's important that you understand why you do things in life. You know, why did you poke so-and-so with the scissors? You know, think about, well, what's your motivation? Did you feel ignored? Did you feel bullied? You know, think of it, gain some self-understanding, and then you wouldn't embarrass the student in front of the other students. You might do a broader discussion. I was talking with a few students earlier in the class today, and we're talking about self-understanding and self-knowledge, why we do things. You might talk generally with the class about that. And so I think all of these are important methods. So let's take a break there for 10 minutes or so. We've had a discussion today about some of the challenge. At least 2 or 3 of the students have said that you can have a sense of being overwhelmed by the amount of material in critical thinking. And then we've started to break this down into a few steps. And we've said the first step is the questions. So we start to ask, but what are the questions that are valuable, that are interesting, that are relevant? And as a teacher, sometimes we've got to keep people focused on the questions. We've said since ancient times and Socrates, the questions are very, very important. Secondly, we have said that observation, what's really happening, is important. Sometimes people might say, you know, Johnny is always hitting me. I've been observing. How many times has John? So observation is important. We want real data. And then we've said we're going to gather some information. That's going to be the next step in logical thinking. So there's a number of steps that we can put down in logical thinking there. But the first step is the good questions. And one of the great skills of gifted teachers is to be able to ask the right questions. And as a few of you have said before, like Socrates, don't rush in with the answers. Don't rush in with saying this is the right answer. Holding back with questions. Dig deeper with the questions. Often so important is to dig deeper. In your essays, think more deeply about some of the questions that could be asked about what you are discussing. And so in essay 2, we're thinking about ourselves. In essay 3, we're thinking about different cultures. How can we ask deeper, bigger questions about education and these ways of thinking? So let's come back after a 10-minute break at about 10 past 10, and we'll look further at the scientific method as it applies in critical thinking. So I'll see you all shortly, and we look at further ways of developing critical thinking. See you shortly.